Animal Adventure 1. My Fight with a Catamount by Alan French. My guide Alric and I had gone in after moose to the country beyond Mudbrook in Maine. There its watershed between the East Branch and the West is cut up into valleys, in one or another of which a herd of moose in winter generally takes up quarters. It was not yet yarding time, for the snow was still only about 4 inches deep, making it just right for the moose hunter, who is at the same time a sportsman. Our task was a slow one. We had to examine each valley for moose tracks, tramping up one side and down the other, or, as we usually managed it, separating at the valley's mouth, each taking a side, meeting at the end, and then, if unsuccessful, taking the quickest way back to camp. And unsuccessful we were, since for 3 days we found no trail, but Alric was not in the least discouraged. "You can never tell about moose," he said. "They travel so. There were moose in this country before the snow, and there are moose within a day's walk on us now. It's just as I told you. We may have to spend 5 days in finding where they are." It was on the 2nd day that we found that, while after moose, we had been tracked by a catamount. The print of its paw was generously large. "I've seen bigger," said Alric, "but this feller's big enough. He's just waiting round, I guess, so as to get some of the meat we kill. We'll remember him," he said, looking up at me as he knelt on the snow, "so's to see that he doesn't spoil the hide or the head." I accepted the theory, and thought little more of the matter for 24 hours. At the end of the 3rd day we found that the catamount had for a 2nd time been following our trail, not only our trail, but also mine. He had followed me all day as I walked along the hillside, looking ahead and on both sides, but seldom behind. Alric examined his tracks carefully for half a mile. "He was in sight of you all the way," he said. "See here, where he stood for some time just shifting about in one place, watching." I saw and thought. After a while it seemed to me a catamount might get tired of waiting for us to kill his meat, and would start to kill it for himself. Unquestionably the easiest game for him to get would be human, for there were no deer in this region, and the caribou were all herded on Katahdin and Traveler. The previous severe winter had decimated the partridges, and big is the catamount that will tackle a moose. I mentioned the theory to Alric. "Yes, perhaps," he said, and eyed me dubiously. Then I wished I had not said anything. It is not well to let your guide think that you are afraid. In the morning, when we had attained our valley's mouth, Alric was about to keep with me instead of leaving me as before, but that made our hunting much slower, for we could cover much less ground, and I sent him around the other way. "All right," he said, "but keep a good lookout behind you now." He disappeared in a cedar swamp, and I made my way along the slope of a hill. I watched indeed behind as well as in front, and in every fox's track I crossed I saw catamounts, until finally I got used to the situation and believed that the Indian devil had concluded to let me alone. The day was fine, the sun shone bright, and the softening snow dropped from the upper branches of the trees kept up a constant movement in the woods. I took and held a good pace, and with my eyes searching the snow ahead and on all sides of me for signs of moose, walked for a full hour, seeing nothing living but the woodpeckers and the chickadees, hearing nothing but the rustle of the branches, as released of their load they sprang back into place. Then, quite needlessly, I found insecure footing under the snow, and plunged suddenly at full length. My rifle whirled from my hand with force, and I heard it strike against the uncovered top of a sugar-loaf stone. I jumped up in fear and hastily examined it. The breech was shattered. My rifle was as useless as any stick. Now I thought of the catamount. As with the broken rifle in my hands, I looked about me in the woods. Bright with sun and snow. I was not entirely helpless, for my revolver and knife were in my belt. Yet a 38 caliber revolver, even with a long cartridge and a long barrel, is not a sure defense against an animal as heavy as myself, which in facing me would present for a mark only a round head and a chest with muscles so thick and knotty that they would probably stop any revolver bullet. I doubted my ability to hit the eye. Very likely I was no longer followed, and in any case I might call Alric. And yet he was too far away for a shout to reach him, and I dared not fire a single shot, for, in order to travel light, I had left at camp all revolver cartridges but those in the chambers. So I started at once for the bottom of the valley, hoping to strike Alric's trail on the opposite slope, and intending to follow it until I caught him. My rifle I left there. It was useless and heavy. I cast many a glance behind me. Almost at a trot, I made my way down the long hillside. I strode on rapidly, for I had certainly a mile to cover before I could strike Alric's trail, much more before I could catch my nimble guide. I was cheerful and unalarmed until, pausing to look behind, I saw, 100 yards away, a tawny animal quickly slip behind a tree. I hastily drew my revolver and knife, but no movement came from its hidden breasts, and rather than stand and wait, I pursued my retreat. I moved more slowly, yet as fast as I could, and still guard myself against another fall, and watch for a rush from behind me. I scanned the ground in front of me, and glanced back every second. For some time I saw no more of the catamount. But when I did see him, I was startled at his nearness. He was within 50 yards. I hurried on as he slipped aside again, but looking again in a moment, I saw him now following boldly upon my trail. I stopped, but he stopped too, and stood regarding me. He was too far away for me to fire yet, and he made no movement to approach. I cautiously continued my retreat, always after a few steps stopping to face him. He stopped as I stopped, yet each time I turned away he came quickly closer. I was already thinking of awaiting him without further movement, when the way was blocked by a ravine. It was cut by the stream that drained the valley, and its steep sides were nearly 15 feet in height. They even overhung in places, but this I did not know then. I was in no mind to trust myself in the deep gully, where the catamount might drop upon me before I could scramble out upon the other side. I walked into an open space and took my stand close to a birch that grew on the very edge of the bank. For 50 feet there was no good cover for the catamount, so armed and determined I waited. The animal skirted the bushes about me, as if examining the ground, and to my disappointment began to come upon me along the edge of the ravine. This gave him the best cover before his charge, and at the same time assured him that the momentum of his rush would not carry him tumbling into the gully. Always keeping too well concealed for a good mark, he kept up behind a fallen tree, on the near side of which a little bush grew, and flattened himself there, watching me, I felt sure, and waiting, in the hope that he might catch me off my guard. I cannot describe how stealthily and noiselessly and altogether perfect his maneuvering was, although the tree that grew about were all small and the bushes bare, and although the white snow gave no background for concealment, he covered himself so perfectly as at one time, and slipped in and out of sight so quickly at another, that although I stood with the revolver pointed and cocked, I could find no opportunity for a shot. As he circled for position, he came ever nearer, and I could see at one time the round head with its short, pointed ears, at another the long, sinuous, muscular body. but they moved so rapidly that before I could shoot, they were gone from sight. All the time he made no sound but a little rustle. In his final concealment I saw nothing of him but his tail that twitched and twitched and twitched. At last I caught the glint of his pale green eye and fired. There came a snarl from behind the bush, and it was dashed to one side and the other, while round head and bared teeth and tawny body came crashing through. I pulled trigger again, and the report sounded muffled, and the smoke for an instant obscured the beast. All was white, when, like a breath, it passed, and I saw the rushing catamount not 10 feet from me. I had not time to fire or crouch, but with ready legs hurled myself to one side and threw my left arm around the tree at the edge of the bank. With awful dread I felt the ground moving away beneath me. I dropped my knife and caught the tree closer, when it too leaned to fall. It hung for a moment over the steep slope, and I could not save myself. The frost had not clamped the overhang to the solid ground. The last fall rain had cut under the first spring thaw, would have brought it down, had not my weight been thrown upon it. With a twist of the tree I fell together. I clutched my revolver desperately, despite the sickening fear of the fall, and in my grasp it exploded in mid-air. Then I fell, and although my body struck easily in the snow-covered ravine, my right hand had been beaten against a sharp rock, and the birch was on me so I could not move. My legs were on the bank, and underneath the snow beneath my shoulders. I soon felt the ice, from which stones protruded. One snow-covered rock received and supported my head. I lay upon my right side, and my right hand, swinging in a curve, had struck with force upon another stone, and lay upon the ice, the only part of my body, except my head, which was free. My left arm was pressed close to my side by the birch, which lay across my body and legs. The weight was not so great but that I could have lifted it, could I have gained purchase. But I must at the same time lift my own body, for my hips were lower than my feet, and my shoulders lower than my hips, and I could not gather 10 pounds of force in that position. My fall confused me somewhat, and I could not at first feel anything, either the pain in my hand or the danger I was in. I noticed only the fine powdery snow which, cast up by the fall, settled upon me as I lay. Then I saw my arm stretched out in front of me, with a bloody hand at the end of it, and I came fully to myself. A pain shot from the finger-tip to shoulder as I closed my hand tighter upon the butt of the revolver. But I clenched my teeth and tried to rise. Tried twice more before I gave it up as hopeless. Then I raised my hand and put it in a better position, propped upon a stone. The movement hurt me terribly, but I thought of the catamount, which would surely not be satisfied with 2 bullets for its breakfast. I was scarcely ready when the head of the beast was thrust over the edge of the bank to look for me. He saw and gloated as a human enemy might have done. His savage snarl was full of intelligence, and his slow approach was deliberate torture. He stood for a moment in full view, then slipped and slid down to the surface of the ice, where 10 yards away he stood and looked at me. I saw his magnificent build, his superb muscular development. As with his body in profile, his head turned towards me, he waited before approaching, playing with my helplessness. I was not entirely helpless. With shaking hand, I took aim. I could not use my thumb to cock the revolver, but drew hard at the trigger, and the hammer rose and fell. My turn for gloating had come now, for the catamount was crying with rage and pain. He fell writhing, striking with his forepaws at the snow, and raising his head to snap at nothing. But this did not last long. Slowly he dragged himself to a sitting position, and I could understand his plight and estimated my own danger. My first 2 bullets had but torn his flesh. My last had broken his back. He was paralyzed in his hind legs, as I have seen a deer, yet he had many minutes to live, perhaps hours, and was strong and angry enough to finish me. Painfully he started on the short journey to me. With his forepaws, his claws digging the snow, he began to drag himself toward me. I could only wait. I had but one more shot, and wished to hold it till he should be close, but my torn hand was weak, and the bruised tendons had already begun to stiffen. Into that deep place where bank and tree overhung, the sun did not come, and I felt the cold striking into my raw flesh. My weight upon my shoulder began to cut off the blood from my arm, and I felt pricking in my flesh. My arm began to go numb, and I feared that I would not be able to shoot. If he could but hurry. He dragged himself as a snail's pace. It would be so long before he came close that my hand would be useless. Yet as he crawled directly at me, the mark was a poor one. I saw with satisfaction that he would have to turn aside for one of the rocks in his path. When at last he reached it and began to drag himself around it, he gave me my last chance. I saw the space behind his shoulder, prayed my bullet might miss his ribs, summoned at last force to my almost dead hand, and fired. A little drift of air blew the smoke aside so quickly that I could see the firefly. He bit savagely at his side, but he crawled on without stopping. For my numb hand the revolver fell without noise in the snow. My fight was finished. He came on. He was only 15 feet away from me when he stopped and coughed. Would he sink, unable to move further? No, he started again, although his legs dragged behind him, impeding, although he left a red trail on the snow, and each step forced a snarl from him. He came on. His glistening eyes and hoarse breath, he forced himself to cross the last space. Minutes passed before he was close enough to touch me. Ah, even as he turned towards my hand to seize it, even as I waited to see rather than feel the crunching of my senseless arm, his head drooped. He raised it once more, but his power was gone. He laid his head, once so powerful, upon my hand, resting his body against the stone that stood high enough to support him, and glared at me with his fierce, malignant eyes. Then the fire changed in his eyes, clouded, flickered, glowed, went out. The last breath was expelled with a wheeze. He was dead. Then my own powers sank, and I thought that I was dying too. Somewhere in the midst of my faintness, I had a sense, as if I felt, rather than heard, hasty, heavy footsteps on the bank above me. As soon as I knew anything clearly, I knew that the tree had been pulled away, and that Alric was bending over me. He had with his ears alert for any sound, with footsteps kept as near to me as they might be with obedience to my order, come rushing to my aid at the sound of my first revolver shot. But the distance was so great that he did not arrive until my fight was over. Bringing Up Carrie by Don Gopal Mukherjee. Carrie the elephant was 5 months old when he was given to me to take care of. I was 9 years old, and I could reach his back if I stood on tiptoe. He seemed to remain that high for nearly 2 years. Perhaps we grew together. That is probably why I never found out just how tall he was. He lived in a pavilion under a thatch roof which rested on a thick tree stump so that it could not fall in when Carrie bumped against the pole as he moved about. One of the first things Carrie did was to save the life of a boy. Carrie did not eat much, but he nevertheless needed 40 pounds of twigs a day to chew and play with. Every day I used to take him to the river in the morning for his bath. He would lie down on the sand bank while I rubbed him with the clean sand of the river for an hour. After that, we would lie in the water for a long time. On the coming out, his skin would be shining like ebony, and he would squeal with pleasure as I rubbed water down his back. Then I would take him by the ear, because this is the easiest way to lead an elephant, and leave him on the edge of the jungle while I went into the forest to get some luscious twigs for his dinner. One has to have a very sharp hatchet to cut down these twigs. It takes half an hour to sharpen the hatchet, because if a twig is mutilated, an elephant will not touch it. When one goes into a jungle, one must remember that there are laws one cannot break. Do you know that anyone who is afraid or hates one of the animals of the jungle gives out an odor which attracts tigers and wolves? Every day that I was afraid to go into the jungle, I did not dare to stay on the ground for fear lest the tigers would smell my presence and attack me. I climbed a tree instead, because when one is in a tree, the odor of one's body does not go into the forest, and the animals cannot tell whether one is afraid or not. It was not an easy job, as you see, to get twigs and saplings for Carrie. I had to climb all kinds of trees to get the most delicious and tender twigs. As he was very fond of the young branches of the banyan tree that grows like a cathedral of leaves and branches, I was gathering some one spring day in March, when I suddenly heard Carrie calling me in the distance. As he was still very young, the call was more like that of a baby than an elephant. I thought somebody was hurting him, so I came down from my tree and ran very fast to the edge of the forest, where I had left him. I looked all over, but I could not find him. I went near the edge of the water, and I saw black something struggling above the surface. Then it rose higher, and it was the trunk of my elephant. I thought it was drowning. I was helpless because I could not jump into the water and save his 400 pounds, since he was much higher than I. But I saw his back rise above the water, and the moment he caught my eye, he began to trumpet and struggle up the shore. Then, still trumpeting, he pushed me into the water, and as I fell into the stream, I saw a boy laying flat on the bottom of the river. He had not altogether touched bottom, but was somewhat afloat. I came to the surface of the water to take my breath, and there Carrie was standing, his feet planted into the sandbank, and his trunk stretched out like a hand waiting for mine. I dove down again and pulled the body of the drowning boy to the surface, but, not being a good swimmer, I could not swim ashore. The slow current was already dragging me down. I clutched at reeds on the shore, but they broke, and the weight of the boy was tiring out one hand while the other was already weak from excessive swimming and clutching at the reeds. Seeing us drift by the current, Carrie was usually so slow and ponderous, suddenly darted down like a hawk and came halfway into the water, where I saw him stretch out his trunk again. I raised up my hand to catch it, and it slipped. I found myself going under the water again, but this time I found that the water was not very deep, so I sank to the bottom of the river and doubled my feet under me, and then suddenly kicked the riverbed, and so shot upwards like an arrow, in spite of the fact that I was holding the drowning boy with my hand. As my body rose above the water, I felt a lasso around my neck. This frightened me. I thought some water animal was going to swallow me. I heard the squealing of Carrie, and I knew it was his trunk about my neck. He pulled us both ashore. As the boy lay stretched on the ground, I recognized the cowherd. He had gone to bathe in the river, had slipped too far out, and not knowing how to swim, had lost and been drowned. I put him flat on his face and on the sand, and the elephant put his trunk about his waist, and I lifted it gently up and down, and then up again. After doing this 3 or 4 times, the water began to come out of the boy's mouth, and not knowing what else to do, because his body was cold, I slapped him very hard all over. After that, I propped him up against the elephant's leg, and then the boy slowly came to. In the meantime, all his cows had wandered away in different directions. As I thought some had gone into the jungle, where I was afraid they might be eaten by tigers, I sent Carrie to bring them back to the river bank. But Carrie got lost himself. So when the cowherd had recovered entirely, I went to look for his cows and my lost elephant. Where do you think I found him? He had gone right into the forest where I had left the saplings and the twigs, and had buried his trunk into the heap and was eating the best of them, without any concern for the cows, the cowherd, or myself. But I could not punish him that day because he had done his duty by saving the life of the boy. Carrie was like a baby. He had to be trained to be good, and if you did not tell him when he was naughty, he was up to more mischief than ever. For instance, one day somebody gave him some bananas to eat. Very soon he developed a great love for ripe bananas. He used to keep large plates of fruit on a table near a window in the dining room. One day all the bananas on the table disappeared, and my family blamed the servants for eating all the fruit in the house. A few days later the fruit disappeared again. This time the blame was put on me, and I knew I had not done it. It made me very angry with my parents and the servants, for I was sure they had taken all the fruit. The next time the fruit disappeared, I found a banana all smashed up in Carrie's pavilion. This surprised me very much, for I had never seen fruit there, and as you know, he had always lived on twigs. Next day, while I was sitting in the dining room wondering whether I should take some fruit from the table without my parents' permission, a long black thing, very much like a snake, suddenly came through the window and disappeared with all the bananas. I was very much frightened because I had never seen snakes eat bananas, and I thought it must be a terrible snake that would sneak in and take fruit. I crept out of the room, and with great fear in my heart ran out of the house, feeling sure that the snake would come back into the house and eat all the fruit and kill all of us. As I went out, I saw Carrie's back disappear in the direction of the pavilion, and I was so frightened that I wanted his company to cheer me up. I ran after him into the pavilion and found him there eating bananas. I stood still in astonishment. The bananas were laying strewn all around him. He stretched out his trunk and reached for one more, far away from where he was standing. That instant the trunk looked like a black snake, and I realized that Carrie was the thief. I went to him, pulled him out by the ear, and joyously showed my parents that it was Carrie and not I that had eaten all the fruit these many weeks. Then I scolded him, for elephants understand words as well as children, and I said to him, "Next time I see you stealing fruit, you will be whipped." He knew that we were all angry with him, even the servants. His pride was so injured that he never stole another thing from the dining room. And from then on, if anybody gave him any fruit, he always squealed as if to thank them. An elephant is willing to be punished for having done wrong, but if you punish him without any reason, he will remember it and pay you back in your own coin. Once I had taken him to bathe in the river. This was summer vacation, and several boys came with me to help. Carrie lay on the bank, and we rubbed him all over with sand. Then he went into the water, and most of us began to play. As Carrie came up from the water, one of the boys, named Sudu, was standing on the bank. For no reason at all, he hit the elephant 3 or 4 times with his whip. Carrie squealed and ran away. I brought him home. The next summer, Carrie had grown so big and fat that I could not reach his back even when I stood on tiptoe. We used to take him out wherever we went, sometimes one riding on his back, sometimes all walking alongside. We gave him luscious twigs, if he behaved well, and sometimes delicious fruit. Once in a while, as a special treat, we would massage his chest with straw, and he would squeal with joy and lay on his back as best as he could, staring at the sun. One day Sudu was standing on the river bank where I had just taken the elephant to give him a bath. That day Carrie had been very good, so we prepared a straw massage for him. As it was very hot, however, we plunged into the river ourselves before giving him his bath, leaving Sudu and the elephant on the bank. Without warning, Carrie rushed at him like a mud bull, threw his trunk about Sudu's neck, flung him into the water, and held him there for a long, long time. When Sudu was finally pulled out of the water and stretched on the ground, he was nearly senseless. When Sudu asked me whether I would punish Carrie for having disgraced him in public like that, I answered that the elephant was not rude. When Sudu asked me why, I said, "Don't you remember that about a year ago you whipped him for no reason at all, almost on the exact spot where he just punished you?" Sudu felt so ashamed of himself that he got angry with all of us and went home alone. But by the next day he had made it all up, and the elephant had forgiven him. As a proof of friendship, when we went to the jungle on a picnic, Carrie carried Sudu on his back. Since that day, Sudu has never hurt a living creature. An elephant must be taught when to sit down and when to walk, when to go fast and when to go slow. You teach him these things as you teach a child. If you say, "Dat," and pull him by the ear, he will gradually learn to sit down. Similarly, if you say "Mali," and pull his trunk forward, he will gradually learn that is the signal to walk. Carrie learned Mali after 3 lessons, but it took him 3 weeks to learn Dot. He was not good at sitting down. And do you know why an elephant should be taught to sit down? Because he grows taller and taller than you who take care of him, so that when he is 2 or 3 years old, you can only reach his back with a ladder. It is therefore better to teach him to sit down by saying "Dot," so that you can climb upon his back. For who would want to carry a ladder around all the time? The most difficult thing to teach an elephant is the master call. He generally takes 5 years to learn it properly. The master call is a strange hissing, howling sound, as if a snake and a tiger were fighting each other, and you have to make that kind of a noise in his ear. And do you know what you expect an elephant to do when you give him the master call? If you are lost in the jungle and there is no way out and everything is black except the stars above, you dare not stay very long anywhere. The only thing to do, then, is to give the master call, and at once the elephant pulls down the tree in front of him with his trunk. This frightens all the animals away. As the tree comes crashing down, monkeys wake from their sleep and run from branch to branch. You can see them in the moonlight, and you can almost see the stags running in all directions below. You can hear the growl of the tiger in the distance. Even he is frightened. Then the elephant pulls down the next tree, and the next, and the next. Soon you will find that he has made a road right through the jungle, straight to your house.